Okay, well, welcome everyone to this evening's event on Christian identity in secular Western Europe. And this is hosted by the European Institute. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is a major new study produced by the Pew Research Center from the United States. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm a professor in the anthropology department here at LSE. I'll be chairing this evening, so let me just introduce our panelists. So on my far left is Professor Nassar Mir, who is a professor of race, identity, and citizenship at Edinburgh University. And then to my immediate left, my colleague in the European Institute and a fellow anthropologist, Ezra Özürek, who holds the chair for contemporary Turkish studies at the European Institute, but also has done quite a bit of research in Germany as well, which I imagine we might hear a bit about this evening. And then to my right, representing the Pew Research Center, Dr. Neha Sahgal, who's the Associate Director of Research at Pew. So what we're going to do is Dr. Sahgal is going to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then my colleagues will offer some reflections and remarks on the report and on what Dr. Sahgal says. Then we will open it up to some questions from you. So we have until about 8 o'clock this evening. I should let you know that this event is being recorded, so you should keep that in mind if you don't want to say anything that's not supposed to be recorded. Okay, without any further ado, I will turn over to Dr. Sahgal. So thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk today about a study we released last week called Being Christian in Western Europe. But before I do that, just a quick introduction to the Pew Research Center. We are a non-partisan, non-advocacy research center. And basically what that means is today I'm going to stay quite close to the data. I'm not going to make any normative statements. I'm not going to make any policy recommendations. The Pew Research Center does not engage in those things. We do not have any advertisers. We're strictly foundation supported. And you cannot commission a Pew Research Center study for any amount of money. We try to kind of think through what are the big themes that people are talking about, where's the public debate, and how can we contribute. There is one normative position we do take, and that is one exception that we make, that we believe that good data is central to good democracy and is essential to good public debate. So, with that introduction, let's get right into it. The results I present today are from a survey we conducted in 15 countries across Western Europe. So about 24,000 people were interviewed, and the interviews were held between April and August 2017 in 12 languages. I can get into the methodology more in the Q&A if there is interest, but right now I'll just say at a high level that we drew the samples randomly, such that the samples in each country are representative of the general population. They resemble the general population in terms of age structure, education, gender, and so on. So, when we talk about religion in Western Europe, it is unmistakably in the context of secularization. Western Europe today is probably one of the most secular regions in the world, and the secularization does continue. We see that quite clearly in the data across all 15 countries that we included in this survey. The vast majority of people say that they were baptized as Christian. Fewer say they were raised as Christian, and even fewer today identify as Christian. Contrast that with the number who say that they attend religious services on a monthly basis or more, and so you have very few people who are actually practicing religion. At the same time, the majority of people in most countries, nearly every country in fact, do continue to identify as Christian, meaning of 71% across the region. So that begs the question, what does Christian identity mean in Western Europe today, where practice is so limited? And we'll try to unpack that a bit more. Well, in the popular literature as well as in some of the academic discourse, a lot of attention is paid to this group, church-attending Christians, people who say that they are Christian and then who say that they attend religious services, they attend church on a monthly basis or more. This is a small group. It's a significant group, but it's a small group, and we do know that it is shrinking, right, with growing secularization. In the UK, for example, right here, just about 18% identify as Christian and say they attend religious services on a monthly basis or maybe more, lower in some other countries. A lot of attention is also paid to this group right here, and those are people who we call religiously unaffiliated, but in the survey they identified themselves as atheist, agnostic, or they said they have no particular religion. This is a large group. It's a growing group in several countries. For example, I'll point to the Netherlands. Right now, only about half of people in the Netherlands consider themselves as belonging to this group. But there is a gap. There's something missing here. And this is a large swath of people who identify as Christian, but say they hardly ever go to religious services, they hardly ever go to church. Some of them are saying they go once or twice a year. But for all practical purposes, they seem to be non-practicing, even though they identify themselves as Christian. So it is easy to look at this large group, in the UK 55%, and say to these people, religious identity is really kind of meaningless. It's hollow. They are cultural Christians. Today I'm going to tell you that that's not the case. Even for this group of people, Christian identity is meaningful. And it is a meaningful marker not just of their religious beliefs, but it is a meaningful marker of their cultural and social beliefs. But let's begin with religion. When we ask people if they believe in God, most people, most Christians in Western Europe say that they do. But what do they mean when they say they believe in God? Here's where it gets interesting. We ask people if they believe in God as described in the Bible, or if they believe in some other higher power or spiritual force in the universe. And here we see some important differences. Among church-attending Christians, and these are aggregated results from all of Western Europe, but we can talk about some country-level results as well. Most church-attending Christians tell us that they believe in the biblical concept of God. God is described in the Bible. But among non-practicing Christians, we still see that the majority do believe in God, but they tend to tell us they believe in some other higher power or spiritual force in the universe, not necessarily God as described in the Bible. So they do still hold on to that religious belief. By contrast, people who are religiously unaffiliated mostly say they do not believe in any higher power or spiritual force in the universe. And this is important context, that even for non-practicing Christians, belief is still an element, right, of why they identify themselves as Christian. We also find that Christian identity is correlated with social, cultural, and political attitudes. So for example, when we ask people about immigration and about immigrants, we find that Christian identity is meaningful. So here we're asking people, should the number of immigrants coming into the country be reduced? And here we find that people who describe themselves as Christian, whether they're church attending or non-practicing, are more likely than those who identify as religiously unaffiliated to say the number of immigrants coming into the country should be reduced. We also ask about opinions of immigrants. So here we're asking people if immigrants coming from the Middle East, like countries like Syria, are they honest? Most people do say that immigrants coming in from Middle Eastern countries are honest, but among the share who say that this group is not honest or holds a negative view of this group, Christians are disproportionately represented. Right? So Christians are more likely than people who are religiously unaffiliated to take a negative view of immigrants. We also find the same pattern when it comes to views of Islam and Muslims. Here I'm showing you the share of people who say Islam is fundamentally incompatible with our country's culture and values. Again, you will see a familiar pattern. Christians, whether they're church attending or non-practicing, are more likely than people who identify as religiously unaffiliated to say that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with their country's culture and values. Similarly, We also find that people who identify as Christian, regardless of their level of practice, are more likely to say they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their family. And in fact, among non-practicing Christians, the number is 3 times as high as the people who identify as religiously unaffiliated. Now, if it isn't already obvious, I think it's worthwhile to state this. Most people, including most Christians, do not tell us that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their family. Okay? The vast majority of people do say that they would be willing to accept a Muslim in their family. These are minority positions. So some sort of media coverage of this study has headlined Christians are intolerant or Christians are bigoted. That's not supported by the data. The majority of people are accepting. But among the significant minority who are not, we do find that Christians are disproportionately represented. And that's an important point to make. Now, all in all, in this survey, we asked 22 questions that dealt with the themes of religious minorities, immigrations, and nationalism. Okay? Now I'm going to break down some of these findings a bit more for you, so you see where UK stands. And I'm going to sort of show you UK in a European context. Okay? And I'll talk you through where the UK is on a number of these questions. So let's begin with whether Islam is compatible with national culture and values. Here we give people 2 options. Islam is fundamentally incompatible with British culture and values or French culture and values, or there is no fundamental contradiction between Islam and national culture and values. Overall, we find that public opinion in Europe today is closely divided on this issue. That is the case in the UK. But that's not that different than what we see in Germany. That's not that different from what we see in the Netherlands. Public opinion is closely divided on this issue. The French, right here, slightly more likely to say there is no fundamental contradiction between Islam and their values and culture. The Finns, on the other hand, take the opposite position. The majority of Finns saying that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with Finnish values and culture, and UK in the middle. Yeah. But what does it mean when someone tells us that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with their national culture and values? To answer this question, we held some focus groups in the UK and in several other countries, and one thing we found over and over again emergent from those groups was people felt the status of women in Islam is incompatible with their own culture and values. So to dig into that a bit deeper, we looked at the data on how people think Muslim women in their country should be allowed to dress. So here we gave people 3 options. If they favor no religious clothing for Muslim women in their country, so they shouldn't be allowed to wear any religious signifier. We also asked them if they favor restrictions on clothing that cover the face only, but other religious clothing would be okay. And then finally, the 3rd option was Muslim women living in their country should be allowed to wear any religious clothing of their choosing. I'm not showing you the 3rd option, but I think the data is pretty clear. Most people in most countries do favor at least some restrictions on the religious clothing of Muslim women. That is also the case in the UK. However, public opinion generally leans toward restricting clothing that covers the face, more so than the share who say that Muslim women living in their country should be allowed to wear no religious clothing. We just don't find that that's the case. Belgium, right here toward the top, it gets close to 3 in 10 who say no religious clothing. Still, more Belgian adults are saying just restrictions on clothing that covers the face. That is also the case in the UK. Very consistent with the rest of Europe. Here's another way we try to measure attitudes toward Muslims. We ask people if they agree or disagree with this strongly worded statement. In their hearts, Muslims want to impose their religious law on everyone else in our country. It's a strong statement, and we deliberately word it quite strongly so that when someone agrees with this statement, they are no doubt registering a negative sentiment toward the group. Okay? You can also understand this statement as a modern-day anti-Muslim trope, right? The idea that they are religious zealots who are out to convert everybody. Okay? We find in the case of the UK that it's on the lower end. About a quarter of Muslim adults did agree with this sentiment, but that's lower than what we see in Austria, which in this case is the median country. That's lower than what we see in Belgium, Denmark, Italy, Norway. It's on the lower end. And that's actually a consistent pattern with the UK. We do find that these kinds of strongly worded tropes have less resonance here than what we see elsewhere. So the discussion today about multiculturalism in Europe centers on Muslims. But historically, Jews have been part of the discussion as well. So we took this opportunity to also ask sentiments toward Jews with another similarly strongly worded statement: Jews always overstate how much they have suffered. Strong statement. It can also be again understood as a modern anti-Jewish trope, right? As a stereotype, and again the same pattern. Fewer resonated with this in the UK. The vast majority of British adults disagreed with this view. That is not the case everywhere. Okay? For example, take a look at Italy, take a look at Portugal, Spain, and even Belgium. More resonance with this sentiment in those countries than what we see in the UK. Still, 16% of British adults did agree with this view. But does that mean that British adults are willing to accept everybody in their homes, in their families, in their neighborhoods? Well, that's where we see a slightly different pattern for the UK. Okay? So when we ask people, are you willing to accept him? Would you be willing to accept a Muslim in your family? Here we suddenly find that the UK sort of jumps toward the top, with the share who say they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their family. This is an interesting pattern. The tropes had less resonance. Still, more British adults than, say, Belgians or Spanish said that they would be unwilling to accept a Muslim in their family. More than a third of British adults took this position, which is pretty close to Italy at 43%. Here, the median country would be France at 24%, and you can see that the United Kingdom is higher, similar to what you see in Germany. We also asked about Jews. Would you be willing to accept a Jew in your family? The bars got shorter, which does suggest that acceptance of Jews is higher than acceptance of Muslims. But you will notice that the lineup of the countries is nearly identical to what you saw for Muslims. Again, the UK right here, just behind Italy. Italy at the top, Denmark, Sweden, Norway at the bottom. Let's take one more look at Muslims just to be sure. You will see that the pattern is nearly identical. And this is an important point. We see in the data that there is a strong correlation between anti-Jewish attitudes and anti-Muslim attitudes. Those who take negative views of Muslims are also more likely to take negative views of Jews, and the reverse is true as well. All right, let's talk about immigration. That's the second component of the kinds of questions we asked in this study. Beginning with, should the number of immigrants coming into the country be increased, remain the same, or reduced? There's a lot of data here, so let me walk you through it. Generally, we find that fewer people say immigration should be increased than those who say immigration should be reduced. This is the case in the UK as well, 32%, 7%. But knowing how polarizing the debate is on immigration in Europe today, we also gave people a middle option, that the number of immigrants coming into the countries should be kept steady, remain the same as it is. And we actually found a lot of people took that option. So in the UK, for example, 57% took that middle option. That was also the case in Switzerland, and that was also the case in most other countries, a very consistent pattern, that people seem to prefer that middle option. Two exceptions are worth pointing out at the bottom, Italy and Belgium. In both countries, you had more people saying immigration should be reduced than those who said it should be kept the same. Roughly half in both countries preferring immigration should be reduced. But we also find that people seem to differentiate between immigrants based on their country of origin. So to dig further into that, we asked people if they have positive views about immigrants coming from the Middle East, countries like Syria. We also asked if they have positive views of immigrants coming from Eastern European countries like Poland. We also asked about African countries, and I'll get into that in a moment. We generally found that more people have positive views about Eastern European immigrants than Middle Eastern immigrants. So here we ask about hardworking. Would you say that immigrants coming from Poland are hardworking? Would you say that immigrants coming from the Middle East are hardworking? And you can see the pattern quite clearly. There's a difference in the evaluation of the two sets of immigrants. We also asked about African immigrants. They fared about the same as Middle Eastern immigrants. Now again, in the UK, stereotypes and tropes resonated less. So you do have a majority of British adults who describe both sets of immigrants as hardworking. Still, the UK follows the same pattern as what we see in most other countries, where the Eastern European immigrants received a more positive evaluation. Okay, final component of the kinds of questions we asked in this study were on nationalism and national identity, beginning with how it is that people define their national identity. What does it take to be truly one of us, truly British or truly French? To understand that better, we gave people various options, and here I'm again showing you the aggregate results across 15 countries. We asked people if it is important to respect the country's institutions and laws to be truly German or to be truly British. We also asked how important is it to be able to speak the national language. And then we asked 3 items that could be considered nativist views of national identity. How important is it to have family background in the country, ancestry in the country? How important is it to be born in the country? And then finally, how important is it to be a Christian? This is a very consistent pattern across Western Europe that the vast majority of people take civic views of national identity. They say you have to respect the country's institutions and laws, and they say you have to be able to speak the national language to truly belong, to truly be a national. Fewer people say that you have to have ancestry. Fewer people say you have to be born there. Still, we do find that a significant share of people, half or more in several countries, do take these positions. And a significant minority does say that you have to be a Christian to truly belong here. So let's break this down a little bit more. I'm going to take a look at these two, to have a family background and to have been born in the country, and we can take a look at how the different countries fare on this. So here's the share of people who say that you have to be born here to truly belong here, and to have family background here to truly belong. And here again you see the UK showing a similar result as what you saw for the question about accepting others in your family. And the tropes resonated less here, but a majority of British adults did say that it is important that you are born here and that you have ancestry here to truly be British. That is not the case in several other countries. I'll point to the example of Sweden. In Sweden, this shows a familiar pattern. Fewer Swedes took these positions. Fewer Swedes said that the tropes resonated with them. Sweden is nearly always toward the bottom. Finally, we measured nationalism in one more way. We asked people if they agree or disagree with this statement. Our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior to others. I nearly always get a slight chuckle for this one, so it's okay to chuckle. Everybody's looking at each other, should I laugh or not? So generally, attitudes on this question are divided in the region. There just seems to be no consensus on whether European cultures are superior to others. Norway was one country where we actually found a majority of people saying that Norwegian culture is in fact superior to others. But you do see France, Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, Sweden again, we're at the bottom, Belgium and Spain saying disagreeing, that our culture is not superior to others. UK is highlighted for you right here. Roughly half of British adults did disagree with this statement, but close behind are the people who agreed, at about 46%, roughly similar to what you see in Germany right here, 51 to 45. So what does this all mean? I've given you lots of different data points, but let's try to bring it all together. Okay. As I mentioned, all in all in this survey, we asked 22 questions related to these 3 themes: nationalism, views toward immigrants, and views toward religious minorities. We found these attitudes are highly correlated with each other. People who have more nationalist views of national identity tend to have negative views of immigrants. People who have negative view of immigrants tend to take negative views of religious minorities as well. These correlations allowed us to take all 22 questions and create a scale. We call this the NIM scale, nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-minority views. It goes from 0, which is the lowest level on the NIM scale, to 10, which is the highest, we'll call it NIM attitudes, but this is what I'm referring to. Okay? So I'll show you the results of the scale. But bear in mind that a number of the questions we ask in this survey are very strongly worded. So you would have to say things like, you don't want a Muslim in your family, Jews overstate how much they've suffered, etc., to score higher on the NIM. Okay? Here are the results. So this is the share in each country who score higher than 5 on the 10-point NIM index. So Italy is the highest of any country we surveyed. It's 10 points higher than the next country down, which in this case is Austria. Sweden is at the very bottom. 8% of Swedes scored above 5 on the 10-point index, and that is significantly lower than the Netherlands. That's the next country down. UK is pretty much smack dab in the middle. So, and that's quite similar to what we see in Germany and what we see in France. Those are the sort of the big three, I guess. But important to keep in mind that Germany is significantly higher than France, but UK is still in the middle of both of those. So I've shown this slide several times now, and nearly each time people start looking at this slide and then they start competing with their neighbors. So the Swedes wonder why the Danes are there, and the Danes are wondering about the Dutch, and that is certainly fine to do. That's a natural instinct to get competitive with your neighbors. However, this data also allows us to dig a bit deeper and to try to understand what factors are correlated with NIM attitudes. And is there any consistency in those patterns across the region? Well, one pattern is quite clear, and that is that Christian identity is associated with higher NIM scores. Both church-attending Christians and non-practicing Christians were more likely than people who identified as religiously unaffiliated to score above 5 on the NIM score. Still, this is not a majority. The majority of Christians did not score above 5 on the NIM scale, and I just want to once again remind people of that. How consistent is this pattern? Well, as it turns out, it's actually very consistent. It's true in nearly every country included in this survey. Let's take a look at UK, and then we'll look at some other countries. Here we are, the UK with church-going Christians, 27%, 24% among non-practicing. That's still higher than 15% among religiously unaffiliated British adults. Let's take another example. Let's take a look at Germany. Germany was one case where we actually saw practice is also correlated with these attitudes. So 41% of German church-going Christians scored above 5. That is significantly higher than the 24% of German non-practicing Christians. Still, among Germans who are religiously unaffiliated, fewer people scored above 5 on the NIM index. And Germany is one case where practice does seem to make a difference, but generally what we found in most other countries is regardless of religious practice, Christians scored higher on the NIM index. But that still leaves a couple questions unanswered. One is, what is the direction of the causality? Is it that being a Christian is making you more likely to have NIM attitudes? Or could it be the other way, that having certain kinds of attitudes is making a person more likely to identify with the dominant religious identity of Western Europe? We don't have the answer to that question, because the data just won't support an answer. And I'd be looking to some of you and maybe to the panel to help us tease that out. If I had to take a guess, I would say both mechanisms seem plausible. This is not a causal argument, this is a correlation. The second question is, what does religion have to do with it? Could it be age? Could it be gender? Could it be education? And where does religion stand in relation to all these other factors? That's an empirical question. That's a question we can in fact answer. To help answer that question, we ran what is known as a logistic regression analysis. Some of you might be quite familiar with this technique, but for those of you who aren't, that's basically a fancy way of saying we took all of these factors listed toward the right-hand side, sorry, I'm a bit left-right challenge, and we considered their effects one by one, holding all else equal. So we considered education, we considered gender, we considered age, and then we considered the role of each of those factors. And this also gives you a sense of the magnitude of the correlation. So all else equal, people who identified with having right-wing political ideology were significantly more likely to score above 5 on the NIM scale. Okay? So that's 35 percentage points right on top. That's intuitive. It seems to make logical sense. On the other end, people who said they personally know a Muslim, and they reported they're personally acquainted with a Muslim, are much less likely to score above 5 on the NIM scale. Contrast that with those who self-reported that they know a great deal or at least something about Islam. It didn't make much of a difference. If anything, it seemed to increase NIM scores slightly. It's a positive correlation. Here we find that even after accounting for other factors like education, gender, and age, religion still seemed to have an effect, and it still seemed to have a significant effect. Okay, significant correlation. And notice that these two numbers are nearly identical. Oh, well, they are identical, not nearly. They're actually exactly the same, which again suggests that it's identity, not practice, that seems to be associated with these views. Some things that didn't make much of a difference. Well, actually, let's talk about education first. Education, being college educated, greatly reduced the probability of scoring above 5 on the NIM scale, but some other things didn't make that big a difference. For example, age. Okay. When you just take a look at the raw data and run a crosstab on these questions by age, you do find that younger people express more tolerant views, younger people are less likely to score above 5 on the NIM, but once you account for education, whether they personally know a Muslim, religion, age didn't seem to have much of an independent correlation. These I find interesting. Saying your personal economic situation is good or that you're satisfied with the direction of your country reduced NIM scores slightly, but limited magnitude. So once again, I come back to where I began, that even in one of the most secular places on earth, religious identity still makes a difference. If you're interested in more, www.pewresearch.org, download the full report. I just gave you a taste of what's in the report.
Thank you very much. We'll turn to our other panelists now who are going to offer some reflections on the report and on what you've just heard about in terms of the summary of some aspects of the report. So I'll turn to our visitor first, Professor Mir.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. Since this isn't a video, I can probably drink some water, because my mum won't know that I'm not fasting this evening. So I thought it was a very interesting set of research which, in many respects, confirmed some things and threw up some other things. And if I may, I'd just like to, in my few minutes, explore 3 things. Firstly, some of the normative implications, I think, for thinking about Christian and non-Christian relations in context of religious pluralism. Secondly, dwell on what the findings imply for the relationship between religion and national identity across the context in which the survey has proceeded. And thirdly, think maybe a little bit more about the interaction of some variables which strike me as especially noteworthy. So, firstly, what should we make of the emergence of this clear pattern, as the report puts it, that both church-attending and non-practicing Christians are more likely than religiously unaffiliated adults in Western Europe to voice anti-immigrant and anti-minority views? Perhaps more specifically, what are the normative implications for those of us who presumed that there was greater sympathy amongst people of religious backgrounds than between people of religion, no religion? What does it mean for civil society initiatives, or indeed for public policy, which proceeds on that kind of assumption, and of which there is a great deal? Thinking about the role of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, in multi-faith encounters as facilitators of that. Think about UK public policy, things like the near neighbour strategy, which devolves a great many resources according to the parish system and the parish configuration. Secondly, what does it mean for the kind of optimistic hope that greater religious pluralism might, on a mass level, facilitate more toleration and respect amongst people of faith. Well, one of the things I was struck by in the findings was that there seemed to be quite a lot of mixed evidence here insofar as what used to be called the contact hypothesis seems to be alive and well, in that knowing Muslim or knowing a member of a Jewish group appears to have some effect in decreasing negative attitudes. Now, in many respects, this first set of questions about the relationship between Christian and non-Christian relations, I think proceeds from a second question, which is about this relationship between anti-immigration sentiment and Christianity more broadly, especially around this idea of national identity, much of which I think has to do with exclusive nationalisms much more than exclusive ideas of Christianity. But of course, you're right, Neha. We don't know in what direction that interaction flows. And to my mind, I'm surprised that we don't, because nationalism and religion in Europe, despite being so salient and so key, remains, I think, profoundly underexplored, despite having a kind of an institutional relationship. Think of the variety of territorially anchored Protestant churches, in post-Reformation Europe, and even where organised religions haven't achieved the established status of something like the Church of England or the Lutheran churches. European societies haven't been subject to God-state separation. Perhaps it's something to do with what Ernest Barker used to call the ways in which nations have long dreamt for their national unity in a common fund of religious ideas. Linda Colley's characterization of an earlier Britain as a Protestant Israel is an illustration of that kind of a way of understanding the relationship between religion and national identity. Jeff Levy's work reminds us outside of Europe that despite its wall of separation, the US has always remained one nation under God. Going further in his work on chosen people, Anglo-American myths and reality, Longley argued some years ago that we're never really going to get to the bottom of issues of national identity unless we delve into its religious components. And in this respect, he argued religion is a much weightier ingredient in contemporary national stories than I think we are willing to admit. And of course, much of the multiculturalist normative agenda begins with this assumption that the challenge isn't to empty out national identities of their religious character. The challenge is to pluralize that with new religious content by recognizing on equal terms other religious minorities. A challenge which fares, I think, very differently across the cases in which the survey has been conducted. What I think the findings do encourage us to think much more about are how these appeals to national identity are kind of calcifying, I think, in and around responses to minority differences. I think that in many respects, national identity is a topic of conversation not in and of itself, but in response and reaction to an increasingly plural and religiously diverse Europe. Thirdly, and as Nair highlighted, which I think still remains a little buried in the report, or somewhere on page 27, but corresponds with a wider pattern of research that people like me, I suppose, have been involved in over the last 10 years, has to do with the ways in which attitudes towards Jews and Muslims are profoundly correlated. So the finding on page 27 is that people who express negative attitudes towards Muslims and Jews are also much more likely to express negative attitudes towards immigrants and vice versa. Now, what the survey, I think, shows is that expression of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish attitudes emerges not separately, discreetly, but as a conjoined activity. And it's a trend that I think Pew have picked up on in the past, especially in the Global Attitudes Project, where they reported a very strong relationship between anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment in the West. And they included the US in that case. The challenge for thinking about the implications of that in the present is that there's clearly a different kind of geopolitics almost to the status of Islam in Europe and to the status of Judaism in Europe, or to the status of Muslims in Europe and Jewish minorities in Europe. There is something going on within the rhetoric of Islamophobia that positions Muslims as a perennial other, almost as though it's a re-attempt of siege of Vienna Gate, whereas even in the most rabid Islamophobe's mind, Jewish minorities kind of an in. There's a civilizational project underway. So when the Pew data identifies this, I think the challenge is for us in terms of interpreting it, to place it within its proper political context. So there's 3 points from me.
Thank you very much. So we'll turn now to Dr. Ozarek.
Okay. Thank you so much. Congratulations to Pew for this, yet again, a very interesting research. I will be commenting on the findings as a scholar of Islam and Muslims in Europe. So much of the discussions about intolerance and radicalization of religion focuses on Muslims. So it is really refreshing and gives another perspective, to focus on Christians, practicing, non-practicing Christians. I mean, it is fresh, but also it shows how connected all these issues are. So how do we understand this data? Does religious identification make people less tolerant or progressive? Or does intolerance find comfort today in Christianity, right? This is the question that you have been saying the data cannot allow us to answer, but as an anthropologist, I'm happy to make comments like that, even in smaller data, so this is great. So today, when public figures talk about problems within Muslim communities in Europe, be it radicalization, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, attention is often directed towards Islamic sources and Muslim authority figures. Politicians or even other public actors often suggest that Islamic preachers should be monitored, or even more, some politicians even suggest that Islamic sources should be scrutinized and reformed. So today, Islam and Muslims are not our topic today, but I cannot help think about this parallel debate. And I would like to suggest, just like radicalization and measures of intolerance are not directly related to Islamic theology, intolerance and xenophobia we are talking about is also not related to Christian theology. Of course, it would not hurt, but I would say it would also not radically help if we monitored what Christian preachers are saying and if we scrutinize the Bible. All Abrahamic traditions can be easily utilized to promote xenophobia, homophobia, sexism, anti-Semitism, and violence. All of these factors exist in all Abrahamic religions. But the same texts can also be utilized to do the reverse. And we have all of these traditions doing quite opposite things in the world. While I was thinking about it, I am thinking about the work of French scholar Olivier Roy on his work on Islamic radicalization. He argues that what we observe in relation to Islamic radicalization is not radicalization of Islam, but he says what we observe is Islamization of radicalism. More precisely, he suggests individuals who commit violent acts in the name of Islam are not pious Muslims who are socialized in that religion and eventually through time they become more radical and they become terrorists. Rather, people who are prone to violence and radicalism find meaning or find representation, find home in Islam. He says in the older days these people may be joining left-wing radicalism or other movements, but the zeitgeist that we have makes Islam a home for radicalization. I suggest the same is true also for intolerant Christians that we talk about. The intolerance that is promoted today finds a comfortable name under Christianity. even though now there are increasingly more overtly racist groups, right? In any of these countries that we listed, you can find a neo-Nazi group who has little to do with religion, and you can join them. But still, most people with xenophobic tendencies today would feel uncomfortable with such groups, but name their feelings as Christian, even though they are not necessarily fed from Christian teachings and practice. I'm talking about here specifically about these non-practicing Christians. So in that sense, Islam or Christianity and also Judaism are not the causes of hatred, but rather hatred nowadays finds comfortable home in these religious identities. How and when did this happen has to do with fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, as it transformed the nature of political alliance in the Western Hemisphere. When European leaders met at Maastricht in the Netherlands in 1991, they agreed to change the basis of the supranational European identity from an economic to a political confederation. For those of you who are old enough will remember that the name of that organization used to be EEC, right? European Economic Community. So it is quite recent that it became the European Union, and since then there is a search for a common identity, a culture, a meaning that brings it together. So there has been debate, is it the humanist tradition, or is it the Christian tradition, or more recently we hear a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition. So in that sense, the religious identity became the name of the identity. So in the post-racist and post-nationalist decades that followed the European enlargement, religion and culture increasingly replaced the notions of nation and race, as Nasser was saying. So I would like to argue that just like Islam is not inherently radical or violent, Christianity is not inherently intolerant either. It is a language of clash of civilizations that promote polarization and emphasizes differences among groups rather than commonalities is what makes Christian identity stand for xenophobia and intolerance, I would suggest. And it is exactly this atmosphere, in this atmosphere, refugees arriving from Syria become first and foremost Muslims. It is very ironic that many of the people who are escaping Syria were escaping ISIS. Many are secular Kurds, even massacred Yazidis, but they all became Muslims, not in their practice, but in their ethnic and racial identity. Okay, so the main glimpse of hope in this otherwise quite grim report is that the xenophobic feelings seem to decrease with higher education and with personal contact with minority groups. So more education and more contact and mixing are the only antidotes so far we know of against hatred, no matter the background of the individual is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you for those stimulating comments on the report. Would you like to respond to any of the points that they raised before
I'm okay with opening it up, or maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm happy to open it up then to questions from the floor that you want to pick up on, anything that our speaker has said, or any of the themes and problematics that our commentators have raised. So, yes, I saw Ben in the.
Ben Ryan from Theos, which is a Christian Society think tank in the UK. I was really interested, thank you so much for the report, it was absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if it was possible, from the data you gathered, to look at denominational differences within. The reason being that when we've done work looking at the British Electoral Survey data, we found quite distinct relationships between people who represent themselves as Church of England voting particularly the Conservative Party versus those who are Catholic voting for Labour. It's pretty difficult to do with other groups because there just aren't enough people in the database. Those two trends are quite clear. But what's difficult in that is, as you alluded to, is whether religion is really the driver in that, when Catholics are disproportionately urban, disproportionately born outside of the UK, much to be poorer. So the question I have therefore is whether you can kind of tease that out probably not in Italy, but perhaps in the UK and the Netherlands, where that data exists, and also, I suppose, to the whole kind of that driver question, and that to what extent, what's the cart leading the horse in some of this relationship?
Great question. Thank you for asking it. In this study, we do report some Catholic-Protestant differences, but we don't make that center stage for precisely the reason you identified, because it's very difficult to tease out confession, whether Catholic or Protestant, from region, from urban, rural, etc. One good example is Germany. So in Germany, we did find that Catholics were considerably more likely than Protestants to say that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim or a Jew in their family. And in fact, the difference was so vast, it was nearly 50% of Catholics who said that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their family, and I think it was lower but similar share for Jews. Now, the problem with saying that is it Catholic, or is it the fact that Catholics are concentrated in the south, in the Bavarian region, and that is also the region that bore the brunt of of incoming refugees? So could that have affected the views? So that is one reason why we didn't get into it so much. And it's the same thing with countries like Italy, which you saw the data for Italy, right? And is that because Italy had an influx of refugees, or is that because of Catholic identity? And it is very, very difficult to answer that question.
Can I start to that? I mean,
yes,
I mean, it's an interesting question, especially about the UK. And I think you would struggle to find a driver that was singularly causal, because I think it's much more fragmented. Mm-hmm. But there is obviously a very strong historical relationship between Catholic migrants to the UK and the centre-left, and to the Labour Party in particular, having something to do with socioeconomic status, of course, but also the kind of path dependencies, institutional opportunity structures where they settle. The big urban metropolitan outside London, Manchester, Liverpool. So I mean, there's kind of a historical feature to that, rather than a purely an attitudinal one. Particularly in the case of those two cases that I mentioned, where there's historically also been a tradition of trade unionism. But what I thought was true of Germany, was that not also true of Italy now in your data? I mean, weren't Catholics also more likely in Italy to reject?
Yes, and in the UK.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I? Sorry, I'm going to pick up on that, if I may, and take advantage of being in the chair, to kind of try to tease out a bit more, or ask you to reflect a bit more on questions of methodology, and in particular, I think maybe as an anthropologist, the question that I want to ask is, when you're asking a question about someone's religious faith, or indeed even some aspect of a deeply held identity, is asking a question like this in Finnish, right? Which is a language that shares, no roots to many of the other languages that you would have been asking the questions in. Just taking an example. I mean, why should I be confident that the articulation of the question in Finnish and in English and in Portuguese are commensurate? I mean, partly given many of the factors being raised here by the first question, and indeed some of the comments in terms of all of the other cultural and social, political and economic factors that may be in play. So could I ask you just...
a great question. Again, thank you for asking it. I think there are two components to what you're asking. One is sort of the nuts and bolts, right? Empirically, how do you make sure that you translate in a way that is actually comparable across countries? The second question you're asking is, I think, a bit broader, more philosophical, that even if translations are comparable, there's a lot of context There are a lot of history. There's understanding that we have to consider. Both, I think, are important points. Let me take on the first part. How do we make sure that the translation is commensurate? This is a big field of research in survey methodologies. What are the best practices in multinational surveys as far as translation is concerned? What we usually do is we spend a very long time, roughly 6 months or so. Nasser is familiar with this because he was involved in some aspect of the development of the study. So typically, we will put the questions through various layers of testing, beginning with linguistic evaluation. So we actually begin with the English language question, and we have it evaluated by linguists belonging to various language families, and they tell us if there's an equivalent in that language or not. If there isn't, we change the English first before we even get into translation. So and sometimes, because we have been asking questions in the United States for a long time, some sort of cultural type of, or how do you say it, idioms slip into the questions, like, is this a big deal? Right? That's a very English way of saying it, but a deal in another language is like a business deal. So immediately, that's sort of a trivial example, but sometimes it can be a bit bigger than that. The linguists can already identify for us that the language family that they know will not have equivalents or will have problems. So there we will target already the English. Once we do the translation, we will again have the linguists reevaluate the language families and see whether things are translating correctly from the English. That's a good check. We catch a lot of problems at that stage, but that's not enough usually. Because many times linguists miss things, or sometimes it's working in one family but not in another. Then we put the questionnaire through a series of tests. The first set of tests we do is cognitive interviewing. So we sit down with one of us is usually observing, but we hire an interviewer. They sit down with somebody, they go through the question, they go through a sample of the questions, especially the most difficult ones, like, is Islam compatible? That was a really tough one. And we not only ask the question, we ask the interviewee to explain to us why they're answering in a certain way and what was going in through their mind as they're answering. That allows us to, again, measure not only the translation, but it also allows us to understand validity. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? That's one stage. After that, we go through various rounds of pre-testing with various populations. We try to take a look at the data, we see what we're getting, and at that point we can be reasonably confident that the translations are working, and they're working in many different contexts. Now, the Finnish case is a good one. I think a number of people have brought up that, oh my God, look at the Finns, they look so strange. Could there be a problem with the translation? So in fact, one of the Finnish journalists who reported on this study asked for the Finnish translation because they wanted to check it. They checked it, it's fine. I knew it was fine because it's gone through our entire process. And actually, we also found that our data on Finland was consistent with several other surveys in Finland. So I was reasonably confident in Finland. But that's the process we usually go through with other countries. Now, your second question, and the broader one, is the influence of social context, political context, history, geography. I didn't focus too much on those types of variables. Not because I don't think that that's important. Actually, on the contrary, I think it's too important for someone like me to be opining on it, because that is not my area of specialization. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a historian. European history especially is not my strong suit. I am a data person, and so for me, immediately I want to go to the individual level, and I want to see if there's any consistency in how individuals answered this question, but then I look to people like you and other people on the panel to think through what are we missing? Where is the history, the anthropology, and how else can we explain these findings?
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, a question.
Thank you very much. I'm a student here, and I'm writing my dissertation on European identity construction and Muslims, so I find it very interesting, your data, and I will use it. My question is that when we talk about compatibility and incompatibility, I find it very tricky, because if we ask European identity, or let's say to be French or British, compatible being Muslim, in this case, I think these terms are very obscure. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, what is to be British, what is to be French, or what is the French culture, because there is no common definition. In this regard, I would like to ask the speakers, is this question really credible, or can we really make an assessment or ask this kind of questions? you.
Thank you.
Oh, the question was to two of you. Would you like to answer first, or
I'm
I
happy
can
to
answer?
speak. Do you want to go?
Go ahead.
No, you
No,
should.
no.
All right.
Very
So
polite.
I think it's absolutely a really important question. To some extent, it's linked partly back to the previous answer that was given in terms of methodological approach. I mean, compatibility doesn't mean uniformity. And one of the things I would say is that in the survey work we do in asking people, especially in Scotland and people in England, similar questions and attitudes to national identity, we try to preface it with a particular take on what we understand national identity to be. You know, and by national identity, we're not talking about things which are about minorities assimilating into, but it's something like comparable values. Now that you can do on a small scale. It's much harder to do on a comparative kind of scale where you're generating so much data. But I mean, in a way, it's not really the task of the investigator as much as the task as the interpreter. So when this data is read in England and we debate it, nobody who wants to be taken seriously will say that, aha, this shows that Muslims can't be British because they're not like a white English person. On the contrary, the challenge is on the part of the commentariat to understand that, well, Britishness is not one single thing, and it's certainly not, a caricature of what we may think of it in the home counties. It's multiple, it's plural, it's something which has been made through a process of contestation, over generation, religious diversity isn't new to the UK, etc. Now those kinds of arguments need to happen within civil society and within the political square, and they ought to happen. But I don't think you can expect researchers to answer those questions in advance. I suppose that's what I was saying.
If I can say, I think these questions don't really answer if they are compatible or not. It only answers if individuals think they are compatible or not. Of course, what is Britishness, what is Germanness? Right? It's like a rainbow. And then what is Islam? That is another rainbow, right? So you can match the two blues, or you cannot. So it is not about the reality, but I think it measures how people feel about it.
But I do think your note of caution, in the context in which we talk increasingly about things like, or some people talk increasingly about things like Eurabia, and a fundamental cultural incompatibility of Islam, monolithic Islam with our values. Yeah, absolutely, this stuff should be read with caution. But it's quite right that there should be a competition over its interpretation in the public square.
Yes, I think the gentleman here. And then
hello, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if the way people interact, the way different groups interact, just depends on who you meet in your life and what your experiences are of other people or other groups that they there touched on. I mean, for example, if you meet people who are into extreme swimming, who keep on pushing you into the water all the time, you might, if that happens maybe not once or twice or 3 times, but 4 or 5 or 6 times, you might decide that you would avoid extreme swimmers and people who push you in the water all the time. That's just human nature. That's what people do. That's what I would do. So that's the first point. The second point is, can you argue that it's probably more helpful to relate identity back to financial identity? I think maybe you'll touch briefly on that as well. And if she could say something more about people's position in relation to how wealthy they are, and what their viewpoints and how that correlates.
Sure. So we did in the final slide that I was showing you, we did take a look at how does people's evaluation of their personal economic situation fare. And certainly you are right, that those who said that they have a good economic situation, or those who said they're satisfied with the direction that their country is taking, were less likely to score above 5 on the NIM. They were less likely to have NIM attitudes. But the magnitude was not as much as some of the literature might suggest it is. That economic existential crisis or job loss, etc., that is entirely what's driving these attitudes. There is that notion in the literature. We did find that identity seems to matter more, even after accounting for people's evaluation of their economic situation, etc. However, education matters as well. Right? Now, that's not necessarily the same thing as having a good economic situation. You can be college educated but still without a job, and that of course happens. But still, we found that college education does seem to have a negative correlation with NIM, but at the same level as identity. Right? So you'll see 15 points in the negative direction. That's the same as what we saw for identity. So I think it would be, from an empirical perspective, a mistake to discount the identity and the cultural component to these attitudes in favor of the economic drivers of these attitudes.
Yes, the gentleman here, and then I'll come back.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk. I think that was really fascinating. My name is Wes Bremer. I'm a PhD student at Cambridge, writing my dissertation on the relationship between right-wing populism and religion, in particular Christianity. And I would be sort of two somewhat related questions to the panel as a whole, and then also to for the survey in particular. And the first is that I was really fascinated when the study came out, because it seems to be not necessarily in contradiction, but in a certain tension with some of the literature that is looking at particular voting behavior, because we actually see that when it comes to voting behavior, Christian identity, in particular Christian practice, has something like what some people call the vaccination effect against voting right-wing populism. So if you look, for instance, in Germany, the AfD does double as well amongst not religious nuns as compared to Protestants and Catholics. And even if you take out the East factor, that's also true throughout the States, and you can actually see that throughout Europe and France and Italy as well. So maybe any of you has a take on that, how to reconcile these two findings. And then the second question is more methodological. I think you have mainly phone interviews, right? You've done. I was just wondering whether you think that had any impact, or how this compares to other studies that maybe do it like more anonymously, especially thinking about things like the social desirability effect, that people may be more prone to say they are Christian or church attending because they think this is socially desirable. Because I was just fascinated by some of the numbers, such as 22% of Brits going to church at least once a month, which a lot of other studies said give different numbers. I was just interested how you would assess that. Thank you very much.
And let me tackle the second question, and then maybe the first one we can all take a look at. All right, so with regard to phone interviews versus doing these kinds of surveys anonymously, yes, that does absolutely make a difference. We do call it an interviewer effect. We call it a social desirability effect. Phone surveys do tend to slightly underestimate the share of people who take negative attitudes. So I would say, if anything, we're probably underestimating these attitudes, but I don't think there's any evidence to suggest in the literature that's by a lot. We might be slightly underestimating it. However, some of the patterns that we see in the data, the correlations we see in the data, would still hold, whether we did it online or we did it by phone. So absolutely, we have to consider the effect of social desirability. Your second question was with regard to church attendance. Yes, it's well established in the literature that people exaggerate their church attendance in order to appear socially desirable, because they, in their mind, are thinking, I'm the kind of person that goes to church. And that's really what I want to convey. So let me tackle, first of all, that we find a pretty consistent result for the share of British adults who are going to church on a monthly basis. So European Social Survey found the same result in their 2016 study. It was roughly, I think, 20% for them. And then in the 2018 data that they just released, it's the same. And it's the same for us too. So if people are exaggerating and lying, they're doing it pretty consistently, which is not to disparage people, but to actually underline the point that this is a valid measure. That when somebody feels the need to exaggerate slightly, they're actually expressing an attitude. They're telling you they're the kind of person who goes to church. Now, last week my daughter was sick. The week before that, I kind of had a headache. life interfered with their ability to. And of course, if we now go to their house every Sunday and check to make sure, then maybe they exaggerated. But this attitude is highly consistent across surveys and highly correlated with other views, which means we're measuring something real. We're measuring something valid, even if it is not exactly a behavior. So that's, I think, something important to keep in mind.
Okay, yes.
There was one other question about voting behavior.
Oh, okay.
Sure. Well, I mean, my simple answer to that would be that both sets of data can be true. I mean, I've seen the data too on the ways in which a religious observance or self-attributed religious observance acts like something like a prophylactic. You called it a vaccination. And given we're only talking about a minority within the people who self-define as Christian who have these intolerant attitudes, then I don't see why both can't be right. But of course, your question also picks up on the classic distinction between attitude and behaviour. What people say and what people say they do aren't always the same thing.
Okay, yes, the woman in the back here.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation and panel. I was wondering, considering the regression and also in light of the first question about differences among different denominations, whether you could speak a bit about the level of variance within the data. I'm sure that's addressed a bit more in depth in the report, but just if there were any interesting things that stood out in terms of that.
Sure. Thank you. Sure. So we ran the regression for everybody in the full sample, and so this is the aggregated regression, and there we sort of controlled for each country. So any one country was not having a disproportionate effect. But then we also ran the model for each country to see if the patterns were consistent. And we did find that as far as religion was concerned, the patterns were remarkably consistent. A couple things are worth noting. In the case of Germany, we did find that religious practice does make a difference. And we did find more NIM attitudes among more practicing Christians. And that stood even after we controlled for other factors. When we controlled for other factors, it came down. It's not as dramatic, but still there. I think that some of the Scandinavian countries presented some interesting anomalies for us. First, the case of Sweden. The low NIM score for Sweden seemed strikingly broad-based. Nothing seemed to move it. So whether you're church attending, non-practicing, unaffiliated, young, old, really few things were moving it, at least in a way that was dramatic enough that it would show up. We also found that in the case of Norway, and I think in the case of Denmark as well, though I have to check Denmark on this, it was the non-practicing Christians who showed slightly higher NIM scores. This was a bit unusual from some of the other places. And the church-attending Christians were a bit lower. And especially on immigration-related questions, the church-attending Christians were showing considerably more accepting attitudes than the non-practicing Christians. So that was also, I think, an interesting anomaly.
Okay, yes, the gentleman over here. You had a question earlier? Yeah.
Well, a quick question on the follow-up on this. I was wondering whether it would be interesting to provide confidence intervals of this study.
Sure. So it's a 95% confidence interval. We're looking at a margin of error of roughly 2 to 3 percentage points depending on the country. So I didn't highlight any result that was not within that. It was not outside of that. Sorry, opposite.
Okay, well that was easy. Yes. So.
Thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. I just wonder with the NIMs, would it have been possible to have built in a question? Did they go to a religious school? Did they go to a secular school? Because I imagine that it might have more significance for older people. I think nowadays schools tend to be more inclusive, tell people about other faiths. I wonder if that was a factor that could be measured.
So if I understood your question correctly, you're asking if we considered the effect of religious schooling on NIM attitudes.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we did not ask that question, but I will write that down for next time.
Could I just very if I may? I'm Jewish. I come from Manchester, and talking about Catholics and attitudes towards Jews. Well, since the 19th century, there's a tradition, not always approved of by the rabbis, big other Catholic priests, of marrying out it's not a little thing.
No.
You know, in Manchester and London, the amount of Jews who marry out, it's 50%.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, do you think that the area of the country has a bearing on this? If there's an established tradition.
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? And when we're talking about Jewish communities, the numbers are so small, relatively, in terms of a national population anyway. So it's hard to measure this stuff. And I remember trying to look at this a few years ago in the census, because we were interested in thinking about mixedness, and we were trying to get a sense of, well, we can talk about ethnic mixedness, and we can talk about the rise of mixed race and mixed heritage, but actually we're not saying very much about mixedness in terms of religious tradition, background, Muslim, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, not Jewish, and so on. And we really struggled with the numbers because the samples are so small. Nonetheless, what I would say is that it's related to a point I suppose I was trying to make, is that religious diversity in the UK is not novel. You know, by no means, right? And there's a kind of the prior history of religious pluralism, which is a cornerstone of what we might call multiculturalism in the UK, and it's a story of Catholic emancipation, and then previously Jewish readmittance, and then kind of Jewish minorities achieving a degree of kind of recognition and state recognition and support, which, you know, precedes Windrush. You know, precedes the arrival from the Indian subcontinent of people like my parents and grandparents and so on, which is a relatively successful model. And you don't really hear a great deal about when you talk about contemporary religious diversity. And so it doesn't surprise me that in Manchester there are levels of out-marriage that aren't necessarily approved by kind of orthodox traditions and priests and so on.
There are Muslim Jewish marriages as well.
Yeah, absolutely there are. Absolutely. Thank you.
Any questions? I don't want to ignore this side of the room here. Any questions from there? Other questions? Okay, so let me ask a follow-up then, if I may. So and it's picking up on some of the I think some of the points that have been made in response to the questions, which is the and I can only speak here in terms of the UK context, but one of the notable figures in your report is the percentage identifying as Christian is much higher than the most recent census, and as well as the British social attitude surveys, which are conducted more frequently. So I don't know if you account for that solely in terms of the this telephone effect. I mean, could you say a little bit more about how? Because it's not insignificant, it seems to me. So could you speak to some of that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that question has come up. First, with regard to the census. When we took a look at the census data, because we were sort of a bit shocked by our numbers, and so we thought, oh God, something's wrong with the survey. So we took a look at the census data. We actually found that the share who identified as unaffiliated was roughly the same in both our survey and in the census. The difference lay in the share Christian. But then I was like, how's that possible? Who's missing? But then I noticed that in the census, there were a decent chunk of people who actually didn't identify, they refused to answer the question.
Yeah.
They didn't
It's a voluntary question.
It was a voluntary question, so they didn't answer. And so that seems to be quite interesting, and it's not unusual in Europe. We also see that in Hungary. We see it in a few other countries that have the religion question in the census. There's a big chunk that doesn't identify, and it seems to be disproportionately Christian because the share unaffiliated is exactly the same, like within like a couple percentage points. So that then gave us some confidence in our results. Now, with regard to European Social Survey, etc., this is a really, really interesting question. The way that the European Social Survey and some other surveys in a similar ilk ask the religion question is as follows. They first ask people, do you have a religion? And then if they say yes, they then follow up with, and what is it? Right? It does seem, the way we ask the question is as follows, what is your present religion, if any? Are you Christian, Muslim, Jewish, so on? And then we read them a list. It seems consistently, this is not just the case in one country or two, this is the case in every country, that we get a higher share identifying as Christian or Muslim or Jewish, whatever the case may be, than surveys that ask what we call this two-step question. So in some sense, by asking people the question in this way, one step, and reminding them what is your present religion, if any, and reminding them of the set of options, we seem to trigger something. And we seem to trigger a response. Now, what we also find is a number of people who I identified as non-practicing seem to then identify themselves as Christian when we ask the question in that way. Whereas when the European Social Survey asked the question, they probably said they were religiously unaffiliated. But as I went into in a lot of detail in the presentation, this group of people, these non-practicing Christians who identified themselves as Christian, this is a meaningful identity for this group. These people do hold religious beliefs. They do show distinct social attitudes, cultural attitudes, and they're quite distinct from people who said they're religiously unaffiliated. So in that sense, I would say that that's a contribution we tried to make to the debate, to show that the Christian identity, even devoid of practice, is meaningful and it is empirically measurable.
Any final questions? Otherwise, I've got another one. I'm just full of questions.
May I ask, actually, if I may, a question of the panel or anybody
yes,
who
course.
chooses to answer?
Yeah.
I was a bit struck by how consistent the data from the UK was with some other big countries in Western Europe. There was some variation, but I thought that UK would be unique. Of course, every country thinks it's a unique snowflake, so there's that. But I really did think that the UK would stand out, that it would be unique. But really, the attitudes were quite consistent, on immigration, on several other issues, and I wondered what you all made of that. Do you believe it, that you're like the rest of Europe or not?
Can I, before anyone, and maybe we'll have Nasser answer that. Why did you think the UK would be unique?
Yeah, well, that's the question.
Maybe this was a naive American way to think about it, but there seems to be this notion, I've heard it many times, and in the context of Brexit, I heard it even more. And I heard it from British commentators, I heard it elsewhere, that British people never thought of themselves as European to begin with. They were off on their own anyway, they're not attached to the mainland, their culture is different, they never connected with the European Union, they never even connected with Europe, much else with the European Union. So in that context, we heard that quite a bit, so I wondered about your reaction.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah.
Well, some first thoughts to that is, there are other reasons to assume why there might be a difference, and that has to do with Europe, the UK having a particular post-colonial tradition. In the way in which it has had a familiarity with religious and cultural and ethnic diversity for a long time, and I've kind of hinted at this in terms of the kind of the imperial, the time when Britain was an empire. But what I struggle with is this assumption the UK isn't simultaneously also European. The UK was always signed up to the idea of Europe as an economic union, not so much as a political union and never really as a cultural union. But that shouldn't imply that the attitudes of the British population aren't necessarily quite similar to certainly Western Europe.
Yeah.
And we found that in other surveys that we've done over the years, particularly when we've tried to kind of gauge attitudes between the British and the French. Even though there are marked differences in thinking about French national identity, actually French social and British attitudes and French attitudes are radically different across a number of domains to do with social issues. So there are good reasons to assume there would be a difference, but there are also understandable reasons not to see.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our guests from the Pew and also from Edinburgh, and to the European Institute for hosting this event. So if you could join me all in thanking the speakers.